Our top story, former Minneapolis police officer Dereck Chauvin has been sentenced to 22.5 years in prison for the murder of George Floyd, whose dying gasp under Chauvin's knee led to the biggest outcry against racial injustice in the United States in generations. The punishment handed out fell short of the 30 years that prosecutors had requested. With good behavior, Chauvin could be paroled after serving 2/3 of his sentence, or about 15 years.
What the sentence is not based on is emotion or sympathy. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge the deep and tremendous pain that all the families are feeling, especially the Floyd family. You have our sympathies. And I acknowledge and hear the pain that you are feeling. I acknowledge the pain not only of those in this courtroom, but the Floyd family who are outside this courtroom and other members of the community. It has been painful throughout Hennepin County, throughout the state of Minnesota, and even the country. But most importantly, we need to recognize the pain of the Floyd family. I'm not basing my sentence also on public opinion. I'm not basing it on any attempt to send any messages. A trial court judge, the job of a trial court judge is to apply the law to specific facts and to deal with individual cases. Mr. Chauvin, as to count one, based on the verdict of the jury finding you guilty of unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony under Minnesota Statute 609.19 subdivision 2 paren 1, it is the judgment of the court that you now stand convicted of that offense. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute section 609.04, counts 2 and 3 will remain unadjudicated as they are lesser offenses of count 1. As sentenced for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd. You're granted credit for 199 days already served. Transported back to the DOC or whichever custody is currently holding him. Anything from the defense?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. We are adjourned.
Minnesota Attorney General Kit Ellison has said that he's hoping the judge's 22.5-year sentence imposed on former officer Dereck Chauvin will be a moment for change. He focused much of his remarks on the desire to improve trust between the community and police officers.
You just can't heal a dirty wound, and when there's little trust, sadly, there's little safety. We need every community member to continue the call for real reform and meaningful change. Peacefully, constructively, but clearly. This is a moment for change, and your call for it is making it happen. What will happen if we don't do it? We will slip deeper into a century-long cycle of inaction. We can and we must make another choice. The choice to break the old paradigm and end the cycle of inaction. The choice to act for accountability and justice. The choice to transform ourselves and our country. For the sake of all the lives that have been lost, for the sake of the terrible sacrifices that too many families like the Floyds have had to make, and for the sake of the many officers who strive to serve and protect with dignity and honor and high standards, and for the sake of the community. Time is up. It's time to act. We're counting on you. We're counting on each other. We believe, and we state and declare, that no one is above the law and no one is beneath it. A police officer is not above the law, and George Floyd certainly is not beneath the law.
Let's return to our top story. Former Minneapolis police officer Dereck Chauvin has been sentenced to 22.5 years in prison for the murder of George Floyd, whose dying gasp under Chauvin's knee led to the biggest outcry against racial injustice in the United States in generations.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, due to some additional legal matters at hand, I'm not able to give a full formal statement at this time. But very briefly, though, I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. There's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest, and I hope things will give you some peace of mind. Thank you.
For the very latest reacting to the sentencing of Dereck Chauvin, let's cross live to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Rise U.S. correspondent Eric Ham. Eric, always great to have you join us on the news. Let's get into it. 22.5-year sentence. Was this expected? Did he fall below expectation?
Well, this is certainly the highest sentence that we've ever seen for a police officer. And then also, when you look at this, you had a white police officer who killed a black man who has received the largest sentence of any police officer. This is a huge breakthrough. However, there are many who are looking at this and saying that perhaps this was also the judge's effort to split the difference. Look, we know the prosecution wanted 30 years, but the minimum sentence that he could have gotten was 15. So clearly the judge went a little bit higher than that, but not as far as going to the full 30 years. Now, it's also important to note that while he does receive a 22.5-year sentence, a state charge is very different than a federal charge, which means with a federal charge, you are required to do at least 90% of your time based on what you have been sentenced to. In this case, he can receive as much as a third off his time for good behavior. So for good behavior, we could see Dereck Chauvin out of prison in about 15, 16 years. And so that's something that also needs to be factored into this sentence that he received today. But also, just very quickly, Benny, I'll note that we do know that he is also facing federal charges as a result of his crime. Now, we do not know if, in fact, if he is convicted of those charges, they will run consecutively and not concurrently. But he's still facing a number of other charges in relation to this crime against George Floyd.
Eric, we could see Judge Cahill painstakingly making a point that his reasons for the sentence duration will be submitted in a report. Is this usual practice?
Yeah, actually it is, because what we see when the judge will outline a sentence, there are sentencing guidelines that the judge typically will follow. In this case, we do know just from the grand scheme of things, there was a timeline of between 15 and 40 years that he could have actually gone for. We know the prosecution asked for 30, but in addition to that, the document that the judge actually laid out, it does, in painstaking detail, as you said, it does lay out why the judge came to this decision. And we also know, and it's important to also recognize, that George Floyd's attorney, that Dereck Chauvin's attorneys have already filed an appeal in this case. So it is incumbent upon the judge to make sure that he follows the sentencing guidelines to the letter of the law, because we do know that they are going to be looked at during the appeals process in this case.
Political leaders, Eric, the political voice. What's been the reaction so far?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We do know that there are some who believe that the sentence certainly fit the crime. There are others who believe that it did not go far enough. But again, look, in the state of Minnesota, we did have a case where you had a police officer, an African-American police officer, who actually shot and killed a white woman. And he received 12 years in prison for manslaughter charges for that killing. Well, Dereck Chauvin actually received a longer decade sentence. So there are many who are actually going to compare these two cases, compare the sentencing, and then, of course, there are those who will not be happy with what was laid out, and there are those who will be happy that you do have an officer who was actually held accountable for such an egregious act, given that we have seen so many instances of police brutality against African Americans in this country. The fact that you do have one police officer who does, in fact, now have to be held accountable for this crime, that is a weight off the shoulders of an entire community of people around the country.
Now, Eric, interestingly, the prosecution wanted 30 years sentencing, while the defense were appealing for probation. This isn't the end of the George Floyd case, right? Because there are 3 more police officers who are due to stand trial. Tell us more.
You're right. In fact, we do know that some of those trials are actually going to get underway as early as August. But also, we know that not only are those officers facing charges against the state, but they're also facing federal charges as well. And here's something else. During the entire trial of Dereck Chauvin, we saw that the narrative in this story, at least that was used by the prosecution, was you had this rogue police officer who was doing something that was against a departmental procedure, who was going against his training, and that he was an outlier for the police and for policing in this country. But now you're going to have the officers who were with him also on that fateful day being charged. And that brings out a very different story in terms of how that is going to play out. And we're going to see that as well. And so now what this does is this brings all of policing together, because you have police who were there who are now on trial and being held accountable. And that's going to play out as well.
Cam, it's great having you. Thank you for your contribution.